Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you a new descent into fear with 8 of the most disturbing true rest stop horror stories ever shared. These accounts are not drawn from imagination or secondhand tales, but from the harrowing testimonies of individuals whose routine highway stops became encounters they wish they could forget. Each story transports us to the desolate corners of America's interstate system, where fluorescent lights flicker over empty parking lots and predators lurk in the shadows between vending machines and bathroom stalls. From late-night fuel emergencies turned deadly to family road trips interrupted by human monsters, these tales reveal the chilling truth that danger often waits where travelers feel most vulnerable. The testimonies have been carefully documented and cross-referenced to ensure their veracity remains uncompromised, while certain identifying details have been altered to protect the privacy of those brave enough to share their ordeals. If you have not yet joined our growing community of horror enthusiasts, subscribe to Buried Files and activate the notification bell, so you never miss a single night when the unknown comes calling. Be sure to leave a comment below and tell us about your own highway experiences or which story disturbed you the most. Driving for 14 straight hours had pushed me past my limit, and I knew that continuing would be dangerously irresponsible for both myself and other drivers on the highway. The digital clock on my dashboard read 1:47 a.m. as I searched desperately for somewhere safe to pull over and catch a few hours of sleep before completing the final stretch of my journey from Seattle to Denver. My name is Balint, though most people have trouble pronouncing it correctly. And I was 26 years old when this incident occurred, working as an independent contractor hauling freight across the western United States in my modified pickup truck. The load I was carrying was not particularly valuable, just industrial equipment bound for a construction site in Colorado. But the delivery deadline was tight and the customer had emphasized the importance of arriving on schedule. I had been making good time until a massive traffic backup caused by a multi-vehicle accident near Boise had cost me nearly 3 hours, forcing me to push deeper into the night than I normally would have preferred. Fatigue was beginning to affect my reaction time and judgment, and I knew that finding a place to rest was no longer optional but absolutely essential. The truck stop I had planned to use was still 40 miles ahead according to my GPS, but my eyelids were growing heavy and I was starting to experience the telltale signs of micro-sleep that had ended the careers of too many long-haul drivers I had known over the years. When I spotted the exit sign for a rest area just 2 miles ahead, I decided to swallow my pride and settle for a few hours of uncomfortable sleep in my truck cab rather than risk falling asleep at the wheel and potentially killing someone. The rest area was larger than most, with separate parking sections for passenger vehicles and commercial trucks, along with a substantial brick building that housed restrooms, vending machines, and a small information center. There were perhaps a dozen other vehicles scattered throughout the lot when I arrived, mostly long-haul truckers who had made the same decision I was making, choosing safety over comfort by sleeping in their cabs rather than pushing forward into dangerous territory. The commercial parking section was well lit by overhead sodium lights that cast everything in an orange glow, and I found a spot near the back where my truck would not block other drivers. I had developed a routine over my years of highway driving for these overnight stops, checking that all my doors were locked, adjusting my mirrors to provide maximum visibility around my vehicle, and positioning my phone and CB radio within easy reach in case I needed to call for help. My sleeping bag was stored behind the driver's seat along with a small pillow and a few personal items, and within 10 minutes of parking, I had transformed my cab into a reasonably comfortable sleeping space. But sleep did not come easily despite my exhaustion, perhaps because of the unfamiliar environment or the ambient noise from highway traffic that continued throughout the night. I dozed fitfully for what felt like an hour or two, waking periodically to check my surroundings and ensure that nothing had changed since I had closed my eyes. The other trucks in the lot remained dark and quiet, their drivers presumably getting the rest they needed before continuing their own journeys in the morning. It was during one of these periodic wake-up checks, probably around 3:30 a.m. based on the position of the moon, that I noticed the sedan parked about 50 yards away from my truck. The vehicle had not been there when I had arrived, and its occupants appeared to be awake and active despite the late hour. Two figures were visible in the front seats, and they seemed to be engaged in animated conversation while occasionally gesturing toward the various trucks in the commercial parking area. At first, I assumed they were simply travelers who had stopped to rest, perhaps discussing their route or arguing about whether to continue driving or wait until dawn. But as I watched through my side mirror, their behavior began to seem increasingly suspicious. They were not settling in for sleep like normal travelers would, but rather conducting what appeared to be a systematic survey of all the commercial vehicles in the lot, taking particular interest in the trucks that showed no signs of occupancy. One of the figures exited the sedan and began walking through the parking area, moving from truck to truck with purposeful determination. He carried a small flashlight that he used to examine license plates and peer through windows, clearly searching for something specific, though I could not determine what that might be. When he reached a large semi-trailer that had been parked near the restroom building, he spent several minutes working at the trailer doors with what appeared to be some kind of tool. I realized I was witnessing either a theft in progress or reconnaissance for a future crime, and I reached for my CB radio to contact other drivers in the area, or potentially reach a state trooper who might be monitoring the emergency channels. But before I could key the microphone, the figure near the semi-trailer looked directly toward my truck, and I had the distinct impression that he had spotted me watching him despite the distance and darkness. He immediately abandoned whatever he had been doing at the trailer and began walking toward my location with a stride that suggested hostile intentions rather than innocent curiosity. I quickly locked my doors and started my engine, preparing to leave the rest area if the situation escalated further. But the sound of my diesel engine turning over apparently alerted his companion in the sedan, because within seconds their vehicle was moving in my direction with headlights off and engine running unusually quiet. The two vehicles were now approaching my truck from different angles, clearly attempting to box me in and prevent my escape from the parking area. I realized that what I had initially interpreted as a simple theft operation was actually something far more dangerous, and that I had become a target because I had witnessed their activities. These were not opportunistic criminals looking for easy cargo to steal, but predators who were prepared to eliminate witnesses to their crimes. I threw my truck into reverse and backed away from my parking spot as quickly as possible, turning toward what I hoped would be a clear path to the exit. But the sedan had anticipated my movement and positioned itself to block the main route back to the highway, while the man on foot was now running toward me with something metallic glinting in his hand. I had to make a split-second decision between confronting them directly or finding an alternative escape route. The rest area was bordered on three sides by dense forest, but I remembered seeing a maintenance road that led around behind the restroom building when I had first arrived. It was not designed for commercial traffic, but my pickup truck was smaller and more maneuverable than a full-size semi, and it might provide an escape route that the sedan could not follow. I turned toward the maintenance road and accelerated hard, bouncing over a concrete curb and onto the narrow gravel surface that wound between the trees. My headlights illuminated a tunnel of overhanging branches as I navigated the rough terrain, and I could hear the sedan attempting to follow behind me despite the obvious damage being inflicted on its low-clearance undercarriage. The maintenance road was clearly not intended for high-speed pursuit, with sharp turns and steep grades that favored my four-wheel drive vehicle over their streetcar. But they were persistent in their chase, and I could see their headlights in my mirrors as they struggled to keep pace through the challenging terrain. The road eventually led to a gate that provided access to the highway maintenance facility. and I was relieved to discover that it was not locked despite the late hour. I drove through the gate and onto a paved access road that connected to the interstate about half a mile from the rest area, effectively bypassing the trap that had been set for me in the main parking lot. The sedan was no longer visible in my mirrors, presumably having given up the chase when the terrain became too difficult for their vehicle to handle. I drove for another 20 miles before stopping at a well-lit truck stop where I immediately contacted the state police to report what I had witnessed and experienced. The dispatcher took my report seriously and promised to send units to investigate the rest area, though she warned me that the suspects had probably fled the scene by the time officers arrived. She also mentioned that there had been several similar incidents reported along that stretch of highway over the past month, involving commercial drivers who had been targeted by individuals who appeared to be conducting organized cargo theft operations. The investigation that followed revealed that the rest area had been used as a base of operations for a criminal organization that specialized in hijacking commercial vehicles and stealing their cargo. They had developed a sophisticated system for identifying vulnerable targets, using spotters to monitor rest areas and truck stops for drivers who appeared to be traveling alone and carrying valuable loads. When they found suitable targets, they would either steal the entire vehicle or force the driver to cooperate through threats of violence. Several drivers had reported being approached by individuals who claimed to have mechanical problems or who offered assistance with directions, only to find themselves surrounded by multiple attackers who demanded access to their cargo. In at least 2 cases, drivers who had resisted or attempted to flee had been seriously injured during the encounters, and one driver had been hospitalized with stab wounds after refusing to surrender his truck keys. The police eventually arrested 4 individuals in connection with the cargo theft ring, recovering stolen merchandise worth over $200,000 and several commercial vehicles that had been taken from rest areas throughout Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming. The investigation revealed that they had been operating for nearly 2 years, using a network of spotters and communication equipment to coordinate their attacks and avoid law enforcement detection. That night taught me valuable lessons about the vulnerability of commercial drivers during mandatory rest periods, and the importance of choosing overnight stops carefully. I learned to avoid isolated rest areas whenever possible, preferring instead to use busy truck stops with security personnel and surveillance cameras. I also invested in better communication equipment and developed relationships with other drivers who could provide mutual support during overnight stops. The cargo theft ring had specifically targeted drivers who appeared to be sleeping alone in their vehicles, counting on isolation and surprise to overwhelm their victims before they could call for help or escape. They had studied the patterns of commercial traffic and identified rest areas that provided optimal conditions for their operations, including limited visibility from the highway and multiple escape routes through surrounding terrain. I continued working as an independent contractor for several more years after that incident, but I never again underestimated the dangers that could lurk in seemingly safe rest areas during the vulnerable hours of the night. The highway system that enables commerce and connects communities across vast distances can also provide cover for predators who understand how to exploit the isolation and fatigue that are inevitable parts of long-distance trucking. That rest area in Idaho looked peaceful and secure when I first arrived, but it had been carefully selected by criminals who understood that tired drivers would be easy targets for robbery and violence. I was fortunate to escape with my life and my cargo intact, but other drivers were not so lucky in their encounters with the same organization. All I wanted was a quick bite before getting back on the highway, something simple and familiar that would sustain me through the remaining 4 hours of driving back to college in Pennsylvania. I had been visiting my grandmother in Virginia for her 80th birthday celebration, and the weekend had been filled with family gatherings and elaborate meals that left me feeling overly full and slightly drowsy. But the drive home was taking longer than expected due to construction delays and heavy traffic. And by the time I reached the large travel plaza along Interstate 95, my stomach was growling with hunger, and my energy levels were dangerously low. May was the name my grandmother always called me, though everyone else knew me as Michelle. And at 21 years old, I was finishing my junior year studying communications at a small liberal arts college in the mountains of central Pennsylvania. This was one of my regular trips home to see family, a routine journey I had made dozens of times over the past 3 years without ever encountering anything more threatening than aggressive drivers and occasional mechanical problems. But something felt different about this particular travel plaza from the moment I parked my Honda Accord in the massive lot filled with cars, trucks, and recreational vehicles. The travel plaza was one of those sprawling commercial complexes that dot the major interstate highways, complete with multiple fast food restaurants, a convenience store, fuel pumps, and even a small arcade area for children. The building itself was designed to accommodate hundreds of travelers simultaneously, with high ceilings, wide corridors, and large windows that provided views of the surrounding countryside. During peak travel times, these facilities buzzed with activity as families, business travelers, and long-haul truckers stopped to refuel both their vehicles and themselves. But despite the busy atmosphere and constant flow of people, I noticed someone watching me from the moment I entered the main building. He was a tall man in his 30s wearing jeans and a flannel shirt that might have looked normal on anyone else. But something about his demeanor set him apart from the other travelers. While everyone else moved through the facility with purpose, heading directly toward their intended destinations, this man seemed to have no particular objective other than observing the people around him, and his attention kept returning to me with uncomfortable frequency. I tried to dismiss my uneasiness as paranoia brought on by too much coffee and too little sleep, but as I made my way through the food court area, I could not shake the feeling that I was being systematically evaluated by someone with predatory intentions. The man maintained a careful distance, never getting close enough to seem obviously threatening, but positioning himself where he could monitor my movements while appearing to be engaged in normal travel plaza activities, like browsing magazine racks or checking departure boards. The food court offered the usual selection of chain restaurants, and I settled on a chicken sandwich and fries from one of the more popular establishments. The ordering process took several minutes due to a long line of hungry travelers. And during that time, I noticed that my observer had moved to a table near the seating area where he could watch me without being directly visible from my position in line. He had purchased a cup of coffee and was pretending to read a newspaper, but his eyes kept flicking up toward me with the practiced casualness of someone who had done this many times before. When I finally received my order, I chose a table in the center of the seating area, surrounded by families and other travelers who provided a sense of security through their proximity. But even in this crowded environment, I felt exposed and vulnerable, like a deer that has caught the scent of a predator but cannot determine the exact location of the threat. The man with the newspaper had positioned himself 3 tables away, close enough to overhear conversations but far enough to avoid drawing attention from other patrons. I ate my meal quickly, eager to complete my transaction and return to the relative safety of my locked vehicle. But the man made no effort to conceal his interest in my activities. When I stood to dispose of my trash, he folded his newspaper and prepared to follow. When I walked toward the restroom area, he abandoned his coffee and moved to a position near the corridor entrance. It became clear that he was not simply a curious observer, but someone who was actively tracking my movements with some specific purpose in mind. The restroom was located down a long corridor that led away from the main food court area, and I realized as I walked toward it that I would be temporarily isolated from the crowds that had provided my sense of security. But I also knew that biological necessities could not be postponed indefinitely, and I hoped that the restroom would offer a brief respite from the unwelcome attention I had been receiving. I pushed through the door marked for women and immediately felt relieved to discover that the facility was occupied by several other female travelers, including a mother with 2 young daughters who were washing their hands at the sink area. But my relief was short-lived, because within minutes of entering the restroom I heard the main door open and close repeatedly, followed by the sound of footsteps that seemed to be pacing back and forth in the corridor outside. Someone was waiting for me to emerge, and based on the pattern of movement, it appeared to be a single individual rather than a group of people passing through the area. I lingered inside the restroom as long as possible, pretending to check my appearance in the mirror while actually trying to formulate some kind of strategy for dealing with my unwelcome follower. When the mother and her children finally left, I was alone in the restroom with nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat and the occasional footstep from the corridor outside. I pulled out my cell phone and considered calling for help, but I realized that I had not actually been threatened or approached directly, which meant that security personnel might dismiss my concerns as overactive imagination. The man had been careful to maintain plausible deniability, never crossing the line into obviously threatening behavior that would justify intervention by authorities. I decided that my best option was to return to the food court and position myself near the information desk or security office, where help would be immediately available if the situation escalated. But when I opened the restroom door and stepped into the corridor, I found my follower standing directly outside, leaning against the wall in a casual pose that would appear innocent to anyone passing by. He smiled when he saw me, and there was something predatory about his expression that made my skin crawl with revulsion and fear. He spoke for the first time since I had noticed him, asking if I was having trouble finding something or if I needed directions to any particular location. His voice was smooth and practiced, with the kind of false friendliness that salespeople use when they are trying to establish trust with potential customers. But there was an underlying current of menace in his tone that made it clear this was not a genuine offer of assistance, but rather an attempt to engage me in conversation and potentially lure me into a more isolated location. I mumbled something about being fine and tried to walk past him toward the main food court area, but he fell into step beside me, maintaining a running commentary about the travel plaza and the various amenities it offered. He mentioned that there were hiking trails behind the building and a picnic area that was much quieter than the crowded interior spaces. He suggested that I might enjoy getting some fresh air before continuing my journey, and he offered to show me the way to these outdoor facilities. The conversation felt like a script that he had rehearsed many times before, and I began to understand that I was not his first potential victim. He had refined his approach through practice, learning to appear helpful and non-threatening while gradually maneuvering his targets toward isolated locations where he could reveal his true intentions. The outdoor areas he was describing would be perfect for an attack, far enough from the main building that screams would not be heard and secluded enough that other travelers would not accidentally interrupt. As we approached the food court, I spotted a state trooper who was purchasing coffee from one of the vendors, and I immediately changed direction to approach him. My follower seemed to understand what I was doing because he suddenly stopped walking and pretended to be interested in a display of travel magazines near the entrance. But instead of abandoning his pursuit entirely, he maintained his position where he could observe my interaction with the officer and resume his stalking once the conversation ended. I explained my situation to the trooper as quietly as possible, describing the behavior I had observed and my growing concern about the man's intentions. The officer listened carefully and agreed that the pattern I described was suspicious enough to warrant investigation. He asked me to point out the individual in question, and when I gestured toward the magazine display, we discovered that the man had vanished completely, apparently slipping away the moment he realized that law enforcement was becoming involved. The trooper took down my information and a detailed description of my follower, explaining that there had been several similar reports at travel plazas throughout Virginia and Maryland over the past few months. The suspect appeared to target young women traveling alone, following them through the facilities and attempting to lure them to isolated areas where attacks could occur without witnesses. Most of the previous incidents had ended with the women managing to escape or seek help before any physical assault occurred, but the pattern suggested a predator who was becoming increasingly bold and persistent. The officer escorted me to my vehicle and waited while I secured my belongings and prepared to continue my journey. He provided me with his direct contact information and instructed me to call immediately if I noticed anyone following me, or if I encountered the same individual at subsequent stops along my route. He also suggested that I avoid stopping at any isolated facilities for the remainder of my trip, sticking to busy truck stops and well-populated rest areas where help would be readily available. I completed my drive to Pennsylvania without further incident, though I found myself constantly checking my mirrors for any sign of pursuit and avoiding stops whenever possible. The experience had fundamentally changed my perception of travel plaza safety, and I realized that predators often use these facilities as hunting grounds because they provide access to vulnerable travelers who are temporarily separated from their usual support systems and protective environments. In the weeks that followed, I learned that the state police had identified and arrested a suspect who matched my description, charging him with stalking and attempted assault in connection with multiple incidents at travel plazas throughout the Mid-Atlantic region. He had been using these facilities systematically, spending hours each day observing potential victims and refining his approach based on what worked and what did not. His vehicle contained detailed notes about different travel plazas, including optimal times for hunting and the locations of security cameras and blind spots. The investigation revealed that he had been escalating his behavior over time, becoming more aggressive and persistent with each encounter as he gained confidence in his methods. Several women had reported being followed to their vehicles, and at least 2 had been physically grabbed before managing to escape. The police believed that it was only a matter of time before he had progressed to more serious crimes, and my report had helped them establish the pattern of behavior that led to his eventual capture. That incident taught me the importance of trusting my instincts and seeking help when something feels wrong, even if I cannot articulate exactly what the threat might be. Predators rely on their victims' reluctance to cause scenes or appear paranoid, and they use that social conditioning to their advantage when selecting and stalking potential targets. The crowded environment of a travel plaza can provide a false sense of security, but it can also offer perfect camouflage for someone who knows how to blend in while hunting for vulnerable prey. I still make regular trips between Pennsylvania and Virginia to visit my family, but I approach travel plazas with much greater awareness and caution than I did before that frightening encounter. I have learned to vary my routes and stops, to remain alert to anyone who shows unusual interest in my activities, and to seek help immediately if I feel threatened, rather than hoping that the situation will resolve itself naturally. My parents had not taken us on a road trip in years, not since Mark turned 8 and I was still too young to remember most of our family adventures. But that summer, Dad decided it was time to drive from our home in Denver all the way to his brother's ranch in Montana, a journey he promised would be filled with scenic mountain views and quality family bonding time. Mom packed enough snacks to feed a small army, and my little sister Sarah bounced excitedly in her booster seat as we loaded up our aging Suburban for what was supposed to be a 12-hour drive through some of the most beautiful countryside in America. We left at dawn on a Saturday morning, with Dad insisting we could make the trip in one day if we kept our stops to a minimum. The first few hours were everything he had promised, with golden wheat fields stretching endlessly on both sides of the highway, and the Rocky Mountains growing larger and more imposing with each passing mile. Sarah and I played travel games and listened to music on our portable CD players, while Mom read aloud from a guidebook about all the historical landmarks we would encounter along the way. But somewhere around hour 6, just as we crossed into Wyoming, Sarah began complaining of stomach cramps. At first, Mom thought it was just car sickness from too many snacks in the winding mountain roads, but when Sarah started crying and holding her side, it became clear that something more serious was happening. Dad pulled over at the first rest stop he could find, a weathered concrete structure with picnic tables and restroom facilities that sat alone in a valley surrounded by towering pine forests. The rest stop was nearly deserted when we arrived, with only a single RV parked at the far end of the lot and what appeared to be a maintenance truck near the restroom building. Dad carried Sarah to one of the picnic tables while Mom rummaged through her purse for the children's medicine she always packed on trips. But Sarah's condition seemed to be getting worse by the minute, and when she started vomiting, Mom made the decision that we needed to find the nearest hospital immediately. The problem was that we were in the middle of nowhere, at least 40 miles from the nearest town according to our road atlas, and Sarah was in no condition to endure another hour of mountain driving. Dad decided that Mom should stay with Sarah at the rest stop while he drove into town to find help and bring back either a doctor or an ambulance. It seemed like the most logical plan at the time, though looking back now I realize how many things could have gone wrong with that decision. I was supposed to stay with Mom and Sarah, but at 8 years old I was more interested in exploring the hiking trails that led into the forest behind the rest stop. While my parents were focused on Sarah's condition and discussing their options, I wandered away from the picnic area and discovered a narrow path that wound between the massive pine trees, disappearing into the shadows of the deep woods. The trail was marked with small wooden signs that promised a scenic overlook just half a mile ahead, and I was curious to see what kind of view it might offer. The forest was cooler and darker than I had expected, with thick canopy blocking out most of the afternoon sunlight and creating an almost twilight atmosphere even though it was barely past 2 o'clock. I followed the trail for what felt like several minutes, listening to the sound of my footsteps on the packed earth and the distant calls of birds. Somewhere high in the branches above me, the air smelled of pine needles and damp soil, and I felt like I was walking through an enchanted forest from one of the fairy tales Mom used to read to us. But when I turned around to look back toward the rest stop, I realized I could no longer see the parking lot or hear the sound of cars on the highway. The trail had curved and twisted through the trees more than I had noticed, and everything around me looked identical. Just endless rows of towering pines stretching in every direction. I started to feel the first flutter of panic in my chest as I realized I might be lost. But I tried to stay calm and retrace my steps back the way I had come. That was when I heard the voices. At first, I thought it might be other hikers or maybe park rangers, but as I moved closer to the sound, I realized there was something wrong with the way they were talking. The voices were low and urgent, with a secretive quality that made me instinctively want to hide rather than call out for help. I crept behind a large boulder near the edge of a small clearing and peered through the underbrush to see what was happening. 3 men were standing in a circle near what appeared to be a makeshift campsite, complete with a camouflage tarp stretched between several trees and camping equipment scattered around a cold fire pit. 2 of the men were dressed in hunting clothes, but the third wore the same type of maintenance uniform I had seen on the truck back at the rest stop. They were examining something spread out on a folding table, and when one of them moved aside, I could see that it was a collection of photographs and what looked like personal items, including driver's licenses and jewelry. The maintenance man was pointing to one of the photographs and speaking in a voice that carried clearly through the still forest air. He was describing a woman with blonde hair and 2 children, one about 8 years old and a younger girl who had stopped at the rest area that afternoon. My blood turned to ice as I realized he was talking about my family and that somehow these men had been watching us from the moment we arrived. One of the hunters asked about the timing, and the maintenance man checked his watch before explaining that the father had left about 20 minutes ago, which meant it would be at least an hour before he returned with help. He said the mother and children were alone and vulnerable, and that this was the perfect opportunity they had been waiting for. The other hunter asked about the RV at the far end of the parking lot, and the maintenance man laughed, saying that those people had been taken care of the previous day and would not be a problem. I had heard enough to understand that my family was in immediate danger, but I was completely lost in the forest with no idea how to find my way back to warn them. The men were still talking about their plans, and from what I could gather, they intended to wait until dark before making their move, which gave me perhaps 2 hours to find help or find my way back to the rest stop. I started moving as quietly as possible away from their campsite, trying to follow what I hoped was the direction back to the trail. The next hour was the longest of my young life, as I stumbled through the forest trying to navigate by the position of the sun through the tree canopy, and the sound of distant traffic that seemed to come from every direction at once. I fell into streams, scraped my arms on thorny underbrush, and fought back tears of frustration and fear as I searched desperately for any landmark that might guide me back to safety. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, and I spent 10 terrifying minutes hiding behind a fallen log, convinced that one of the men had discovered my presence and was hunting me through the woods. But finally, just as the shadows were beginning to lengthen and I was starting to lose hope, I spotted the concrete roof of the rest stop building through the trees ahead. I ran the final 100 yards without caring about the noise I was making, bursting out of the forest and into the parking lot, where I found Mom sitting at the same picnic table, still holding Sarah and looking anxiously toward the highway for any sign of Dad's return. I tried to explain what I had seen and heard, but I was crying and out of breath, and Mom initially thought I was just scared from getting lost in the woods. It was not until I mentioned the specific details about the photographs and the maintenance truck that she realized I was telling the truth about something genuinely threatening. She gathered up Sarah and our belongings, and we ran to our Suburban, locking all the doors and sitting in terrified silence as we waited for Dad to return. When Dad finally arrived with a local doctor and a sheriff's deputy, they found the maintenance truck abandoned near the restroom building, and a search of the surrounding forest revealed the campsite I had described, complete with evidence of multiple previous crimes. The 3 men were arrested 2 days later at a truck stop in Idaho, and we learned that they had been using the remote rest area as a hunting ground for months, targeting isolated families and lone travelers who stopped there during their cross-country journeys. The RV that had been parked at the far end of the lot was found buried in a shallow grove about a mile into the forest, along with the remains of an elderly couple from California, who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Sarah recovered from what turned out to be acute appendicitis, but it was months before any of us could talk about what might have happened if I had not stumbled across that campsite and overheard their plans. We never finished that road trip to Montana, and my family has not taken a long car journey together since. But I learned that sometimes the most innocent family moments can become something far more sinister, and that predators often hide in plain sight, wearing uniforms and smiles that make them seem helpful rather than dangerous. The forest may have been beautiful and peaceful on the surface, but it was also hiding secrets that could have destroyed my family forever. It was 2:17 a.m. when my gas gauge hit empty and the yellow warning light began its relentless blinking on my dashboard. I had been driving for nearly 6 hours straight, pushing through the monotonous stretch of Interstate 40 that cuts through the heart of Oklahoma, heading back to college after a long weekend visiting my girlfriend Kyle back home. The highway was deserted at this hour, nothing but darkness stretching endlessly in both directions, broken only by the occasional semi-truck thundering past in the opposite lane, its headlights briefly illuminating the barren landscape before disappearing into the night. The nearest rest stop, according to my GPS, was still 12 miles ahead, but with my fuel tank running on fumes, I knew I would never make it that far. My heart sank when I spotted the faded exit sign for what appeared to be the only gas station within a 30-mile radius. The sign was weathered and partially obscured by rust stains, advertising a place called Quick Stop, with an arrow pointing down a narrow off-ramp that seemed to vanish into complete darkness. I had no choice but to take the gamble. The off-ramp descended into what felt like a forgotten corner of the world. The overhead highway lights disappeared behind me, and my headlights became the only source of illumination cutting through the thick Oklahoma night. The road was cracked and poorly maintained, with weeds growing up through the asphalt and no reflective lane markers to guide the way. After about 2 miles of winding through what appeared to be abandoned farmland, I finally saw the harsh fluorescent glow of the Quick Stop rising from the darkness like some kind of beacon. The gas station sat alone in a sea of cracked concrete, surrounded by nothing but empty fields and a few skeletal trees that swayed ominously in the night breeze. The building itself looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1980s, with faded yellow and red paint peeling from its walls and a collection of vintage soda advertisements plastered across the windows. 2 fuel pumps stood under a flickering canopy light that cast strange shadows across the forecourt, and I could see through the grimy windows that a single clerk was manning the register inside. I pulled up to the pump closest to the building, keeping my engine running while I assessed my surroundings. The place felt wrong somehow, though I could not immediately put my finger on what was bothering me. Perhaps it was the complete isolation, or the way the fluorescent lights hummed with an electrical buzz that seemed too loud in the silence, or maybe it was just the exhaustion from my long drive playing tricks on my mind. I turned off my engine and stepped out into the cool night air, immediately noticing how the silence seemed to press in around me like a physical presence. The fuel pump was an ancient model that required payment inside, so I walked across the cracked pavement toward the entrance, my footsteps echoing, strangely in the stillness. Through the glass door, I could see the clerk behind the counter, a thin man in his 50s wearing a stained uniform shirt and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He looked up as I approached, and something about his smile made me pause for just a moment before pushing through the door. The interior of the station was cramped and cluttered, with narrow aisles packed with dusty merchandise and a lingering smell of stale cigarettes and motor oil. The clerk watched me with an intensity that felt uncomfortable, his pale eyes tracking my movements as I grabbed a bag of chips and an energy drink from the cooler. When I approached the counter to prepay for my gas, he leaned forward slightly, and I noticed his fingernails were unusually long and yellowed. "Traveling alone tonight?" he asked, his voice carrying a strange lilt that made the innocent question sound somehow predatory. I nodded curtly and handed him 2 $20 bills, eager to complete my transaction and get back on the road. He processed the payment with deliberate slowness, his fingers lingering on mine when he handed me the receipt, and his smile widened to reveal teeth that were stained brown from years of tobacco use. Outside, I hurried to my car and began filling my tank, constantly glancing over my shoulder toward the station windows. The clerk had moved from behind the counter and was now standing directly at the glass, watching me with that same unsettling smile. The fuel pump seemed to be dispensing gas at an unusually slow rate, and with each passing minute I felt my anxiety building like pressure in a kettle about to boil over. That was when I noticed the pickup truck. It had been parked behind the building when I arrived, barely visible in the shadows, but now it was idling near the edge of the property with its headlights off. I could make out the silhouette of someone sitting in the driver's seat, though I could not determine if they were watching me or simply waiting. My hands began to shake as I gripped the fuel nozzle, and every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to leave immediately. The gas pump finally clicked off at $37, still several dollars short of what I had paid, but I did not care about the difference. I hung up the nozzle with trembling fingers and rushed back toward my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I heard the pickup truck engine rev behind me. When I spun around, I saw that it had moved closer, now positioned directly between my vehicle and the exit, effectively blocking my most direct route back to the highway. Through my rearview mirror, I watched as the clerk emerged from the station and began walking casually across the parking lot toward my car. He moved with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen, and in his right hand I could see the metallic glint of what appeared to be a large wrench or tire iron. The pickup truck door opened, and a second figure stepped out, this one wearing dark clothing and a ski mask despite the warm September night. My engine turned over on the third try, and I threw the transmission into reverse, backing away from the pump at dangerous speed. The clerk had to jump aside to avoid being hit, and I heard him shout something that was lost in the sound of my spinning tires on the loose gravel. The pickup truck lurched forward to maintain its blocking position, but I had already committed to a different escape route, steering my car across the rough terrain behind the station building. My suspension protested as I bounced over deep ruts and scattered debris, but I kept my foot pressed firmly on the accelerator, using my headlights to navigate between rusted barrels and abandoned equipment. In my rearview mirror, I could see both men running back toward the pickup truck, and within seconds its headlights flared to life as they began their pursuit across the uneven ground. I reached a chain-link fence that separated the station property from an adjacent field, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was trapped. But years of neglect had left a section of the fencing partially collapsed, and I was able to drive through the gap, my car scraping against the twisted metal posts as I forced my way into the open pasture beyond. The pickup truck was larger and heavier, and I gained precious seconds as they struggled to navigate the same obstacle. The field was a maze of irrigation ditches and scattered hay bales, and I drove by pure instinct, following what appeared to be a farm road that led toward a distant line of trees. My headlights swept back and forth as I searched for the path, and behind me I could see the pickup truck gaining ground, its more powerful engine and four-wheel drive giving it a significant advantage over my compact sedan on the rough terrain. Just when I thought they would overtake me, I spotted another road running parallel to the tree line, and beyond that, the blessed sight of highway lights in the distance. I pushed my car harder than I ever had before, the engine screaming in protest as I bounced and skidded across the final stretch of open ground. The pickup truck made one last desperate surge to cut me off, but I managed to reach the paved road with perhaps 50 yards to spare. Once I merged back onto the interstate, I drove for another hour before I felt safe enough to stop at a proper rest area with security cameras and other travelers. My hands were still shaking as I called the state police to report what had happened, though I was not surprised when they told me that the gas station had been abandoned for over 3 years, and that local authorities had received similar reports from other travelers who claimed to have been lured there by outdated GPS databases. I never found out what those men had planned for me that night, and I try not to think about what might have happened if I had been less alert, or if my car had broken down in that isolated place. But I learned an important lesson about trusting my instincts and the dangers that can lurk in the dark spaces between cities, where predators wait patiently for vulnerable travelers who have no choice but to stop. Now, whenever I take long trips, I make sure to fill my tank before the sun goes down, and I research my route carefully to avoid any remote stops that might put me in a similar situation. That night taught me that the real monsters are not the ones we imagine in our nightmares, but the ones who smile at us from behind a counter and ask if we are traveling alone. The engine started making that grinding noise just past midnight, somewhere along a desolate stretch of Interstate 70 that cuts through the heart of Kansas wheat country. I had been driving for nearly 8 hours straight, making the journey from my college in Colorado back to my family home in Missouri for spring break. and I was still at least 3 hours away from my destination when my 10-year-old Honda Civic began protesting the long trip. At first, it was just a subtle vibration in the steering wheel, but within minutes the noise had escalated to a metallic scraping sound that could not be ignored. Jessica was my name then, though I go by Jess now, and at 20 years old I had never experienced a serious car breakdown during a long-distance trip. My father had always handled the maintenance on my vehicle, and I naively assumed that regular oil changes and tire rotations were sufficient to prevent any major mechanical failures. But as the grinding noise grew louder and my engine temperature gauge began climbing toward the red zone, I realized that my automotive ignorance was about to become a serious problem. The highway was virtually empty at that hour, with nothing but darkness stretching endlessly in both directions and only the occasional semi-truck rumbling past at highway speeds. My cell phone showed no signal bars, which was not unusual for this remote section of Kansas, where cell towers are spaced dozens of miles apart and entire counties can be dead zones for wireless communication. The nearest town, according to my road atlas, was still 15 miles ahead, but with steam beginning to rise from under my hood, I knew I would never make it that far. I spotted the exit sign for what appeared to be a rest area about 2 miles ahead, and I coaxed my failing vehicle down the off-ramp with the engine temperature gauge now firmly planted in the danger zone. The rest stop was nothing more than a small parking area with a few picnic tables and a concrete restroom building, surrounded by fields of winter wheat that stretched to the horizon under a moonless sky. There were no other vehicles in the lot, no emergency phone, and no attendant on duty, just a single security light that cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I turned off my engine and sat in the darkness for several minutes, listening to the metallic pinging sounds of cooling metal and trying to formulate some kind of plan. My trunk contained a small toolkit that my father had insisted I carry, but I had never learned to use most of the tools, and attempting repairs in the middle of the night seemed both dangerous and futile. My best option appeared to be waiting until dawn and hoping that another traveler would stop and offer assistance, or that my cell phone might pick up a signal as the towers switched to different transmission patterns during off-peak hours. I decided to check the restroom facilities and then settle in for what promised to be a long and uncomfortable night in my car. The restroom building was a typical highway department structure, built from cinder blocks and painted in that institutional beige color that seems to be standard for government facilities. The women's side was accessed through a heavy metal door that squeaked loudly on rusted hinges, and the interior was illuminated by a single fluorescent fixture that flickered intermittently and cast strange shadows on the concrete walls. The facilities were clean enough, though clearly not maintained very frequently, and I was grateful to discover that the water was still running and the toilet paper dispensers were not empty. But as I was washing my hands at the small sink, I heard the sound of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot outside. My first reaction was relief, thinking that help had finally arrived, but something about the way the engine idled, low and rumbling like a large pickup truck or van, made me pause before rushing outside to flag down the driver. Through the small frosted window near the sink, I could see headlights positioned near my disabled Honda, and I watched as a tall figure got out of what appeared to be a dark-colored pickup truck and began walking around my vehicle. The person was carrying some kind of flashlight or lantern, and they seemed to be examining my car with more interest than a casual Good Samaritan might display. Instead of approaching the restroom building to look for the stranded motorist, they spent several minutes checking my license plates and peering through my windows at the personal belongings I had left on the seats. I remained frozen by the window, watching as the figure returned to their truck and appeared to be speaking with someone else inside the vehicle. The passenger door opened and a second person emerged, this one shorter but moving with the same deliberate manner as they approached my car from the opposite side. Both figures were now circling my Honda like predators examining their prey. and I realized with growing alarm that they had made no attempt to locate me or offer assistance despite the obvious breakdown situation. The shorter figure produced what looked like a crowbar or prying tool and began working on my driver's side door, while the taller person kept watch toward the restroom building. I understood with crystal clarity that these were not good Samaritans stopping to help a stranded motorist, but opportunists who had spotted a vulnerable young woman's vehicle and decided to take advantage of the situation. My personal belongings, including my purse and laptop computer, were visible through the windows, and they were clearly planning to burglarize my car while assuming I was either asleep inside or had wandered away from the area. But then the shorter figure said something to their companion, and both of them turned their attention toward the restroom building where I was hiding. The taller person began walking directly toward the women's entrance, moving with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. I realized they had spotted evidence of my presence, perhaps footprints in the gravel or the fact that my car keys were missing from the ignition, and they were coming to find me. The restroom building had only one entrance and no windows large enough to climb through, which meant I was essentially trapped with nowhere to run or hide. The fluorescent light continued its erratic flickering, creating a strobe effect that made everything seem surreal and nightmarish. And I could hear footsteps approaching the metal door with deliberate slowness. I looked around desperately for anything that might serve as a weapon, settling on a metal trash can that I could potentially use to defend myself if necessary. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I held my breath as the handle began to turn with a metallic scraping sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the confined space. But instead of bursting in immediately, the person seemed to be listening, perhaps trying to determine if I was actually inside or if the building was empty. I pressed myself against the concrete wall beside the door, gripping the trash can and preparing for whatever was about to happen. That was when I heard the distant sound of another vehicle approaching from the highway, its headlights sweeping across the parking lot as it descended the exit ramp. The footsteps outside the door immediately retreated, and through the small window, I watched as both figures ran back toward their pickup truck with obvious urgency. Within seconds, their vehicle was speeding away into the darkness, leaving me alone with my disabled Honda and whoever was arriving in the new vehicle. The newcomer turned out to be a long-haul trucker who had noticed my car with its hood up and decided to check if anyone needed assistance. He was a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a genuine desire to help, and when I explained what had just happened with the two suspicious individuals, he immediately contacted the state police on his CB radio. He also had enough mechanical knowledge to diagnose my engine problem as a broken water pump, which explained the overheating and grinding noises I had been experiencing. The trucker stayed with me until a state trooper arrived about 30 minutes later, and together they helped arrange for a tow truck to transport my Honda to the nearest repair shop. The officer took a detailed report about the incident with the pickup truck and the attempted break-in, though he explained that without license plate numbers or better descriptions of the suspects, there was little chance of tracking them down. He did mention that there had been several similar reports along that stretch of highway over the past few months, involving stranded motorists who were targeted by opportunistic criminals. I never found out what those two individuals had planned for me that night, and I try not to think about what might have happened if the trucker had not arrived when he did. The repair shop was able to fix my water pump the following day, and I completed my journey home to Missouri without further incident, though the experience had fundamentally changed my perspective on highway travel and personal safety. Since that night, I have never undertaken a long-distance trip without ensuring my vehicle is in perfect mechanical condition, and I carry a fully charged cell phone with a car charger as backup. I also invested in a roadside assistance plan and learned basic automotive troubleshooting from my father, so I would never again be completely helpless in a breakdown situation. Most importantly, I learned to trust my instincts about dangerous situations and the importance of having an escape plan even when you feel trapped. The Kansas wheat fields may look peaceful and harmless during daylight hours, but they can hide predators who prey on vulnerable travelers during the darkest hours of the night. That broken water pump probably saved my life by forcing me to hide in that restroom building, because if I had been sleeping in my car when those men arrived, this story might have had a very different ending. After 6 hours of driving, I could not wait any longer. My bladder felt like it was about to burst, and the next rest stop, according to the highway signs, was still another 20 miles ahead on Interstate 77 through the mountains of West Virginia. I was 17 years old and on my first solo road trip, driving from my hometown in Ohio to visit my aunt in North Carolina for the summer. My parents had been reluctant to let me make the journey alone, but I had finally convinced them that I was mature enough to handle the responsibility of 8 hours behind the wheel. David was what everyone called me then, though most people use Dave now. And I had been looking forward to this trip for months as a symbol of my growing independence and adulthood. My father had spent weeks preparing my car for the journey, checking the oil and tire pressure and making sure I had emergency supplies in case of a breakdown. But no amount of preparation could have readied me for what I was about to encounter at a seemingly innocent rest area tucked into the mountains of rural West Virginia. The rest stop appeared just as I was reaching the point of desperation, marked by a small brown sign that indicated facilities and picnic tables were available 1 mile ahead. I took the exit with relief flooding through me, following a winding access road that descended into a small valley surrounded by dense forest on all sides. The facility was larger than I had expected, with a substantial brick building that housed separate men's and women's restrooms, along with a collection of picnic tables and vending machines arranged under a covered pavilion. There were several other vehicles in the parking lot when I arrived, including a family with young children who were eating lunch at one of the picnic tables, and an elderly couple walking their small dog along a nature trail that led into the surrounding woods. The scene looked perfectly normal and peaceful, with birds singing in the trees and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of mountain wildflowers through the clean air. I parked near the restroom building and hurried inside, grateful to finally address the physical discomfort that had been building for the past hour. The men's restroom was a typical highway facility with white tile walls and industrial fixtures that showed signs of heavy use, but appeared to be reasonably clean and well maintained. There were 3 urinals along one wall and 2 toilet stalls on the opposite side, with a row of sinks and mirrors near the entrance. The lighting was provided by fluorescent fixtures that hummed quietly overhead, and everything smelled of industrial disinfectant mixed with the faint odor of pine trees drifting in through a small ventilation window. I was standing at the middle urinal, finally experiencing the relief I had been craving for the past hour, when I heard the main door open behind me. Footsteps crossed the tile floor with a deliberate pace that seemed somehow different from the casual gait of other travelers I had encountered during my journey. Instead of proceeding directly to one of the other fixtures, the person stopped somewhere near the sinks, and I could feel their presence behind me like a weight pressing against my shoulders. The normal sounds of a rest area seemed to fade away, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that stretched on for far longer than felt natural. I finished what I was doing and moved toward the sinks to wash my hands, glancing in the mirror to see who had entered behind me. The reflection showed a middle-aged man wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, standing motionless near the paper towel dispenser with his hands at his sides. He was not using any of the facilities, just watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When I reached for the soap dispenser, the man moved closer, positioning himself directly behind me with no apparent purpose other than to invade my personal space. I could see his reflection more clearly now, and there was something wrong with his expression, a predatory smile that revealed yellowed teeth and eyes that seemed to be evaluating me like a hunter sizing up potential prey. He was larger than me by at least 50 pounds and several inches in height, and his presence filled the small restroom with an atmosphere of menace that made my heart begin to race. I tried to finish washing my hands as quickly as possible, but the man spoke before I could reach for a paper towel. His voice was low and gravelly with an accent I could not immediately place, and his words made my blood freeze in my veins. He asked if I was traveling alone, and when I did not respond immediately, he stepped even closer, close enough that I could smell cigarettes and unwashed clothing and something else that might have been fear or excitement. The question felt like a trap because answering truthfully would confirm my vulnerability, but lying might provoke him into some kind of aggressive response. I mumbled something non-committal about meeting friends nearby, trying to project confidence I did not feel while edging toward the exit. But the man moved to block my path, his smile widening as he realized that I was frightened and looking for a way to escape the confined space. He began asking more questions about my destination and travel plans, each query becoming more personal and intrusive than the last. He wanted to know where I was staying, whether anyone was expecting me at a specific time, and how long I planned to be in the area. His tone remained conversational, but there was an underlying threat in his demeanor that made it clear these were not innocent inquiries from a friendly fellow traveler. I tried to push past him toward the door, but he grabbed my arm with a grip that was painful and left no doubt about his intentions. He pulled me back from the exit and pressed me against the sink counter, his face now close enough that I could feel his breath on my neck. He whispered that he had been watching me since I arrived, and that he knew I was alone and vulnerable. He described in disturbing detail what he planned to do, and I realized that I was in immediate physical danger with no obvious way to call for help. The restroom door was heavy and would muffle any sounds I might make, and the family I had seen outside was probably too far away to hear me scream. The man seemed to understand this as well because his grip on my arm tightened and he began forcing me toward one of the toilet stalls at the back of the restroom. I could see that he had planned this encounter carefully, choosing a location where he could corner his victims without interference from other travelers. But as he pushed me toward the stall, I remembered something my father had taught me about self-defense during our preparation for this trip. He had emphasized that in a dangerous situation, the most important thing was to create enough chaos and noise to attract attention from other people nearby. I stopped resisting his grip and instead threw my full weight backward into him, driving my elbow into his ribs as hard as I could while simultaneously screaming at the top of my lungs. The sudden reversal caught him off guard, and his grip loosened enough for me to break free and sprint toward the exit. I burst through the door and into the bright sunlight, still screaming for help and running toward the family at the picnic tables. The man followed me outside, but when he saw that other people were now aware of the situation and looking in our direction, he quickly changed course and headed toward a dark-colored van parked at the far end of the lot. The father from the family rushed over to help me, and together we watched as the van sped away from the rest area and back onto the highway. The man called 911 on his cell phone while his wife comforted me and helped me calm down enough to provide a coherent account of what had happened. The state police arrived within 20 minutes and took a detailed report, though the officer explained that without a license plate number, it would be difficult to track down the suspect. The trooper did mention that there had been several similar incidents reported at rest areas throughout West Virginia and neighboring states over the past year, all involving a middle-aged man who targeted young travelers, particularly those who appeared to be alone and vulnerable. He suspected that this individual was working a circuit of remote rest stops, moving from location to avoid detection while preying on unsuspecting victims. I completed my journey to North Carolina that same day, though I made sure to use only busy truck stops and well-populated rest areas for the remainder of the trip. The experience had shaken my confidence badly, and it took several weeks before I felt comfortable being alone in public restrooms or other isolated spaces. My parents were understandably upset when I told them what had happened, and they insisted on driving down to escort me home at the end of the summer. That encounter taught me valuable lessons about situational awareness and the importance of trusting my instincts when something feels wrong. I learned that predators often rely on the social conditioning that makes us reluctant to cause scenes or appear rude, and that sometimes being loud and disruptive can be the difference between becoming a victim and escaping unharmed. The mountains of West Virginia are beautiful and peaceful, but they also provide perfect cover for individuals who prey on travelers passing through remote areas. I never found out what that man had planned for me in that restroom, and I hope I never encounter anyone like him again. But I will always be grateful for the self-defense lessons my father insisted on teaching me, because they probably saved my life that day. With a crying baby and a full diaper bag, I desperately needed to find a place to change my 6-month-old son and take care of his increasingly urgent needs. I had been driving for nearly 5 hours from my home in Atlanta to visit my mother in Jacksonville, and little Seth had been fussing for the past hour despite my attempts to soothe him with music and snacks. The travel plaza that appeared on my GPS seemed like the perfect solution, advertising family restrooms and baby-changing facilities that would allow me to address his needs in a clean and private environment. My name is David, though most people call me Dave, and at 29 years old, I was still adjusting to the challenges of single parenthood after my wife had left us 6 months earlier. This was only my second long-distance trip alone with Seth, and I was learning that traveling with an infant required much more planning and flexibility than I had previously realized. Every stop became a complex operation involving diaper bags, bottles, and the constant worry about his safety and comfort in unfamiliar environments. The Travel Plaza was one of those large commercial complexes that serve multiple interstate highways with dozens of fuel pumps, several fast food restaurants, and a sprawling main building that housed everything from convenience stores to tourist information centers. It was exactly the type of busy, well-maintained facility that I preferred when traveling with Seth, because the constant flow of families and business travelers provided both security and the amenities that made infant care more manageable. I parked near the main entrance and gathered the supplies I would need for what I hoped would be a quick diaper change and feeding session. Seth's crying had escalated to the point where other travelers in the parking lot were beginning to notice, and I felt the familiar pressure of being a single father in public with a distressed child. The diaper bag felt heavier than usual as I slung it over my shoulder and lifted Seth from his car seat, trying to project competence and control while internally feeling overwhelmed by the logistics of the situation. The family restroom was located down a long corridor that branched off from the main food court area, clearly marked with colorful signs that advertised baby changing stations and private spaces for families with young children. The corridor was well lit and appeared to be regularly maintained, with clean tile floors and walls decorated with cheerful murals that were obviously designed to create a welcoming atmosphere for traveling families. Several other families were moving through the area, which added to my sense that this was a safe and appropriate place to tend to Seth's needs. The family restroom itself was larger and better equipped than I had expected, with a proper changing table, a comfortable chair for nursing mothers, and even a small sink at an appropriate height for children. Everything appeared to be clean and well-maintained, and I felt relieved to have found such a suitable space for taking care of Seth's immediate needs. I locked the door behind us and began the familiar routine of laying out a changing pad and gathering the supplies I would need. Seth had calmed down somewhat once we were in the quiet environment of the restroom, and I was able to change his diaper efficiently and clean him up without the usual struggle that sometimes accompanied these necessary tasks. But just as I was finishing with the diaper change and preparing to give him a bottle, I heard footsteps in the corridor outside, followed by what sounded like someone testing the door handle to see if the room was occupied. At first, I assumed it was simply another family waiting to use the facility, and I called out that I would be finished in just a few more minutes. But instead of moving on to find another restroom or waiting patiently in the corridor, the person outside began knocking on the door with increasing persistence and urgency. The knocking quickly escalated to pounding, and I could hear a male voice demanding that I open the door immediately. The voice was aggressive and threatening in a way that made it clear this was not a normal request from another traveler, and I felt my heart rate increase as I realized that Seth and I might be in danger. The man outside was shouting that he knew I was in there with a baby, and that he had been watching me since I arrived at the travel plaza. He described details about my car and my appearance that proved he had indeed been observing me, and his knowledge of these specifics made the situation feel much more threatening than a random encounter. I gathered Seth close to my chest and moved to the far corner of the restroom, as far from the door as possible, while trying to think of some way to call for help or escape the situation. My cell phone was in my back pocket, but I was afraid that taking the time to dial 911 might provoke the man outside into more aggressive action. The family restroom had seemed like such a secure space when I had entered, but now it felt like a trap that had left us vulnerable and isolated from the safety of the crowded main building. The pounding on the door continued for what felt like several minutes, accompanied by increasingly disturbing statements about what the man intended to do once he gained access to the room. He seemed to understand that I was trapped and had no immediate way to escape, and his confidence was growing with each passing moment. Seth had begun crying again in response to the noise and my obvious distress, which only seemed to encourage the man outside to become more aggressive in his demands. But then, suddenly, the pounding stopped, and I could hear the sound of multiple voices in the corridor outside. Someone else had apparently heard the commotion and come to investigate, and the aggressive man was now trying to explain his behavior to what sounded like a security guard or law enforcement officer. I could not make out all the words being spoken, but the tone had changed dramatically from threatening to defensive, and the man seemed to be trying to minimize the situation. I waited several more minutes before cautiously unlocking the door and peering out into the corridor, where I found a travel plaza security guard speaking with a state trooper who had apparently been called to investigate the disturbance. They explained that the man had been arrested and removed from the facility, and that several other travelers had reported seeing him following families with young children throughout the travel plaza. His behavior had escalated over the course of the afternoon, and my encounter had been the most serious incident so far. The security guard walked Seth and me back to our car and waited while I secured him in his car seat and loaded our belongings. He explained that the man had been targeting single parents, particularly fathers traveling alone with infants, because he believed they would be less likely to put up resistance or call for help when confronted. The family restroom had been part of his strategy because it provided a private space where he could corner his intended victims without interference from other travelers. The trooper took a detailed report and provided me with case numbers and contact information for following up on the investigation. He mentioned that similar incidents had been reported at travel plazas throughout Georgia and Florida over the past month, and that they suspected this individual was part of a larger pattern of predatory behavior targeting vulnerable families during highway travel. The arrest might help them connect him to other unsolved cases in the region. I completed my journey to Jacksonville that day, but the experience had fundamentally changed my approach to traveling with Seth and my awareness of the potential dangers that could lurk in seemingly safe family facilities. What had started as a routine stop to address my infant son's needs had turned into a terrifying encounter that could have had much worse consequences if other travelers had not intervened when they did. Since that day, I have never used a family restroom without first ensuring that other people are aware of my presence and approximate timeline for completing my business. I also invested in a personal safety device that could summon help quickly if needed, and I developed relationships with other single parents who could provide mutual support and awareness during travel situations. The travel plaza industry markets these family facilities as safe havens for parents and children, but my experience taught me that predators understand this marketing as well and use it to identify and target vulnerable victims. I thought leaving at 5 a.m. would mean empty highways and a peaceful drive from my apartment in Chicago to the medical residency program in Houston, where I was scheduled to begin orientation on Monday morning. Kay was what everyone called me, though my full name is Catherine. And at 25 years old, I had just completed medical school and was embarking on what I hoped would be a prestigious surgical residency at one of the top teaching hospitals in Texas. The drive was supposed to take about 14 hours, and I had planned to make it in a single day with minimal stops to ensure I arrived well-rested for the demanding schedule that awaited me. My Honda Civic was packed with everything I owned, from medical textbooks and surgical instruments to personal belongings and enough clothes to last through my first few months of residency. The early departure time was part of my strategy to avoid the heavy traffic that typically plagued Interstate 45 through Dallas. And I had calculated that starting before dawn would allow me to reach Houston by early evening with plenty of time to settle into my new apartment and prepare for the following day. The first few hours of the drive went exactly as planned, with virtually no traffic on the highway and perfect weather conditions that made for easy driving. I stopped once for fuel and coffee at a large truck stop near the Arkansas border. But the transaction was quick and I was back on the road within 15 minutes. By the time the sun was fully up, I had made excellent progress and was ahead of my planned schedule, which allowed me to relax and enjoy the scenic countryside of eastern Texas. But somewhere around 11 a.m., as I approached the outskirts of Dallas, I began to notice a pattern in the vehicles around me that made me increasingly uncomfortable. 3 different cars seemed to be maintaining the same relative positions to my Honda, regardless of changes in traffic patterns or my own adjustments to speed and lane position. At first, I dismissed this as coincidence, but as the pattern continued for more than 30 miles, I began to suspect that I was being deliberately followed by multiple vehicles working in coordination. The cars were unremarkable: a white sedan, a dark SUV, and a pickup truck that looked like thousands of others on Texas highways. But their behavior was distinctly abnormal because they maintained formation around my vehicle in a way that suggested they were communicating with each other and following some kind of predetermined plan. When I changed lanes, at least one of them would mirror my movement within a few seconds. When I adjusted my speed, they would make corresponding adjustments to maintain their relative positions. I decided to test my suspicions by taking an exit for what appeared to be a large rest area, thinking that if these vehicles were simply coincidentally traveling in the same direction, they would continue on the highway rather than following me off the main route. But to my growing alarm, all 3 vehicles followed me down the exit ramp and into the rest area parking lot, where they positioned themselves in different sections of the facility in a way that provided them with clear sight lines to my Honda from multiple angles. The rest area was larger than most, with separate parking sections for passenger vehicles and commercial trucks, along with a substantial main building that housed restaurants, gift shops, and tourist information displays. Under normal circumstances, it would have felt like a safe and welcoming place to take a break during a long journey, but the presence of my apparent followers had transformed it into something that felt more like a trap than a refuge. I parked near the main entrance and sat in my car for several minutes, trying to decide what to do next. The 3 vehicles that had followed me were positioned strategically throughout the parking lot, and I could see at least 2 of their occupants using cell phones, presumably to coordinate whatever they had planned. It was clear that this was not a random encounter, but rather a carefully orchestrated operation that involved multiple participants and advanced planning. One of the vehicles, the white sedan, was parked near the exit in a position that would allow its occupants to follow me if I attempted to leave the rest area. The dark SUV had positioned itself near the fuel pumps where its driver could observe both the main building entrance and my parking spot. The pickup truck was parked in the commercial vehicle section, but close enough to the passenger car area that its occupant could quickly reach my location on foot if necessary. As I watched, a man got out of the pickup truck and began walking casually toward the main building, but his path took him directly past my Honda in a way that allowed him to examine my vehicle and its contents. He was tall and wore sunglasses despite the overcast sky, and something about his demeanor suggested that this was reconnaissance rather than a coincidence. When he passed my car, he paused slightly and appeared to be memorizing details about my license plate and the personal belongings visible through my windows. I realized that I needed to seek help immediately before whatever these people had planned could be put into motion. The main building was busy with other travelers, including families with children and elderly couples, which suggested that help would be available if I could reach the safety of the crowded interior. But the distance from my parking spot to the entrance felt like an enormous gap that would leave me exposed and vulnerable to anyone who wanted to approach me. I gathered my purse and cell phone and made a quick dash from my car to the main building, moving as fast as possible while trying not to appear panicked or draw unnecessary attention to myself. Once inside, I immediately sought out the information desk and explained my situation to the attendant, a middle-aged woman who took my concerns seriously and directed me to the rest area security office. The security guard listened to my account and agreed to accompany me back to my vehicle while calling for assistance from local law enforcement. But when we returned to the parking lot, all 3 of the suspicious vehicles had vanished, apparently having fled the scene once they realized that I had sought help and that security personnel were becoming involved in the situation. The state trooper who responded to the call took a detailed report and explained that there had been several similar incidents reported along Interstate 45 over the past few months, involving what appeared to be organized groups that targeted lone travelers, particularly young women driving expensive vehicles or those who appeared to be carrying valuable belongings. The tactics I described matched the pattern of behavior that had been observed in other cases, including the use of multiple vehicles to box in their targets and the strategic positioning at rest areas to prevent escape. The trooper followed me for the next 50 miles to ensure that I was not being followed by other vehicles, and he provided me with contact information for law enforcement agencies along my remaining route in case I encountered any further problems. He also suggested that I avoid stopping at isolated rest areas for the remainder of my journey, sticking instead to busy truck stops and well-populated facilities where help would be readily available. I completed my drive to Houston without further incident, arriving safely at my new apartment complex where security personnel helped me unload my belongings and park my car in a secure garage. The experience had been terrifying, but it also taught me valuable lessons about highway safety and the importance of trusting my instincts when something feels wrong. The investigation that followed revealed that the group I had encountered was part of a larger criminal organization that specialized in carjacking and kidnapping along major interstate corridors throughout Texas and surrounding states. They had developed sophisticated methods for identifying and targeting vulnerable travelers, using multiple vehicles and communication equipment to coordinate their attacks and avoid detection by law enforcement. Several arrests were made in connection with this organization over the following months, and investigators found evidence linking them to dozens of similar incidents involving lone travelers who had been followed, threatened, or attacked at rest areas throughout the region. My report had provided crucial information that helped law enforcement understand their operational methods and develop strategies for preventing future incidents. That dawn departure had seemed like such a logical way to avoid traffic and arrive safely at my destination. But it had actually made me more vulnerable to predators who understood that early morning. Travelers were often alone and carrying their most valuable possessions. The empty highways I had hoped would provide peaceful driving conditions had also provided perfect hunting grounds for criminals who relied on isolation and surprise to overwhelm their victims.